And welcome. And we'll start, of course, with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. So the truth is that, at least according to my notes, we are actually here. We had not done the note here by Torah Temimah. We are doing Torah Temimah on Parshat Noach. And we are still on this verse, on verse 20. And it was talking about how Noah had taken the animals. He built an altar to the Lord. He took from all the habahema, HaTorah, the pure domesticated animals. That's how we're understanding this term behema. I think we need to be careful, as we're going to see in a little bit, I hope, that we can't just translate it that way. Umikol ha'of, and from all the fowl, all the birds, hatahor, that were pure. Remember, he took 7 of the pure kinds. Vayal olot b'mizbeach, and he made offerings, burnt offerings, on the altar. Okay, so that's the verse in the Torah, and this is what we were on to. We actually read this, but we are going to try and read the Torah Temimah on that. So, mikol habema vagomer. So the issue here is it says from every, right? So this word kol means that we have to include, because it could have said he offered habehema, haTorah, but the fact that it says it's from all pure animals, etc. And notice, by the way, so often it'll say bahema and chaya. And in those cases, we will say bahema refers to domesticated animals and chaya refers to wild animals. But here it just said bahema, did not include chaya. On the other hand, it included all off. And obviously it left out any reptiles and things like that, right? Creeping things. Ad shelohu kamakam, Amishkan, up to the time when the tabernacle was built. Hakol ksherim lahakriv. Every kind of animal was kosher. It was appropriate to place on the altar. Again, we would be talking about pure animals, though, although it doesn't say that necessarily. We'll see. Well, there we go. Yeah, we're going to see. It's going to define that, right? Behema, right? Behema. And look at this. Here it says it includes chaya, right? So behema and chaya, I'll leave those untranslated for the moment. For off and birds, fowl, right? Zacharim unekevot, male and female. Tmimim, whether they're in perfect condition, uva ale mumim, or whether they show signs of any defects, right? Tehorim, now look at this. Pure velot me'im, but not impure. Only pure, and that's because it says tahor in that statement, right? The Amar Kra, because the scripture actually says, Vayikach mikol ha'ba'ema haTorah. It says, he took from all the pure animals, umikol of hatamar, and all birds, pure birds. So the tahor is what makes that we cannot take impure. But whether they have defects or not doesn't say anything about that, right? Behema kamashmahu. So when it comes to behema, understanding, domesticated animals, kamashma, or just as it implies. Chaya, and this is the interesting statement, right? Chaya, bis, bichlal behema, are included in the category of behema. So what would be a chaya tahora? We would be calling deer, right? In other words, we're talking basically about ungulates. They have to chew the cud, they have to have a split hoof. They are, in fact, wild animals, specifically the class of deer that are still wild. They're not domesticated, but they are tahor. Zacharim, male, unakevot, so, right, male or female, doesn't matter. Tmimim uvale mumim, right? So those all would be included. Tmimim, pure, sorry, tmimim usually means um, perfect, but it said even if they have defects. Oh, sorry, Tmimim would be perfect. Uvale mumim, right? And those that have Baal mum is something that has a defect. Forgive me. Okay, so let's now take a look at this here. So he goes right into this. As I said, it's sort of unusual to consider chaya to be included in behemah, since we usually say that there's a distinction, right? We usually mention the two if we're going to mention domesticated animals and beasts, wild animals. Ha dechaya bichlal behemah. The fact that we are including non-domesticated animals included in the category of behemah. Mevu'ar lefanenu. It's clarified in front of us. It's going to become more clarified. But Parshat Shmini, in the Parsha of Shmini in Leviticus. That's where we encounter a major section regarding kashrut, right? What are clean animals, what are not. But pasuk zot hachaya, where it says this is, and it uses the term chaya, right? And it's talking about animals that can be consumed. Umikol, umikol, and from the word kol, in other words, kol you could say is in quotation marks, marbe zacharim unekevot. From that we can include both males and females. Tmimim uvale mumim, both pure, perfect, in perfect condition, and those who show signs, certain defects. Veyesh od girsot binyan ze, and there are, in fact, other texts that speak about this, that talk about this as well. Vehetaknu al pi girsat Rashi. So there are other versions of this text. He says, but we've copied down hetaknu. We've copied down based on the version that Rashi has in his that he quotes. So that is it for that. Judith, do you have anything you want to ask about it before we move on to something else? Okay. If I don't hear from you, I'm assuming the answer is no, because you can always put your hand up if you want to say something. All right. So let's take a look at. We'll take a start at least the next verse. Vayarach Hashem et reach hanichoach, and God, the Lord, right, inhaled this fragrant odor. Vayomer Hashem, and God said, or El Libo, to his heart. So it obviously means he thought, Lo osif lekalel od, I will never again curse et ha'adamah, the land, right, or the earth, ba'avur hadam, on account of man. Ki yetzer lev, this is a very, may I call it a pregnant verse. Ki yetzer lev, because the desire of the heart, ha'adam, of man, ra min urav, is wicked from his youth. V'lo osif od lahakot, and I will no longer strike et kol chai, all the living, kasher asiti, as I did. Ha! Interesting statement. So it's saying that, of course, what's it defining here? I guess what Freud, if you're Freudian, would describe as the id, right? I think the Greek is thanatos. In other words, there's an element within all of us, every single human being, that is self-destructive. In other words, it's saying that it is in human nature to be destructive, self-destructive. And the issue, of course, is that I think it is what can prompt both the worst and the best in us. That it is part of the very nature of the human condition to have to deal with appetites, and that's what I think we're talking about, appetites that are necessary for our survival, and yet at the same time, if they are unleashed, they will reap destruction. So, but that is not the reason that God will destroy the world, simply on the basis of that, because that is human nature, right? So, but it's not an excuse. It's an explanation, but it's not an excuse. So let's take a look here. Vayarach Hashem v'gomer. So the Lord inhaled this fragrance, right? Amar Rabbi Chanina. This is actually a lovely, lovely statement. Rabbi Chanina said, Kol ha-mitpateh beyeno. Anyone who can be reconciled when he drinks wine. Yesh bo midat kono. This is Sharfstein. That's what that abbreviation means. That I was looking at Sharfstein's translation of this. This part of the Torah Temimah exists in translation. Yesh bo midat kono emulates his creator. Shinemar, as it states, Vayaruch Hashem et reach hanichoach, as it says, the Lord inhaled this wonderful fragrance, Vayomer, and he thought, etc. Lo osif lekalel, I will no longer curse. And there's a lovely Torah Temimah on this. Umevoar la'el, and it's clarified above Besugya in the Sugya. So it's talking about this particular Sugya in Eruvin on page 65b. There is this discussion. A Sugya is a discussion of a particular topic in the Talmud. Okay, so derecha, that smell, or that is to say fragrance, right? Dumya demishtaya he, that smell and drinking, right? Or liquid, something like that. But it has to do with they're very similar, right? They're similar. In other words, inhaling is very similar to drinking, right? We are taking something into our bodies and experiencing it. So the act of inhaling and the act of drinking are considered to be extremely similar. And what this passage that we just read is trying to say, Midah tovahi, it is a good quality, sheyehe adam noach lihitratzot, that it should be easy for a person to be appeased, that he shouldn't be stubborn when someone is trying to say, I'm sorry, and trying to reconcile. Lemi shehiknito, to one he should be easy to be reconciled with one who annoyed him, right, or hurt him in some way, keshemavakshim mimenu, when it is requested of him, when that person comes and says, please forgive me. V'ya'an, and because ki al pirov hanahug, and because it is in many cases it is a custom, the fayes et chavero, for a person to try and appease his fellow al kos yayin, on a glass of wine, over a glass of wine, lachen amar, and for that reason he says, hamid pateh beyeno, one who is reconciled, who can change his mind, right, with his wine. That's the statement on here. So the idea of not allowing one's anger to prevent one from being reconciled when someone sincerely asks for forgiveness. I think it's a beautiful statement, and we will leave it for here today. Take that down there. There's some more really wonderful statements to be made about that. So that is it. We got a brief little piece for today. Judith, if you want to say anything before I stop the recording.
Oh, well, I don't know if it needs to be before the recording ends, but is this the only time where you are called to do a sacrifice and it doesn't matter if it's blemished?
Yes. Yes, at least if you are talking about Israelite sacrifice. Correct. Bringing a blemished sacrifice is like giving you a gift that is in some way, blemished. It's insulting. It doesn't show a real desire. But to the point when the Mishkan, and I discussed this in a previous session, we talked about this in a previous session, that the Mishkan represented a layer of connectivity that had not occurred up to that point. And that when you look at the position of where the Mishkan is built, and of course we've been reading these just recently, it comes immediately after the acceptance of the Torah, an acceptance of a commitment to practice the commandments, etc., that is when God commands the idea of building the Mishkan. And so, because there is this level of connectivity with the divine, it demands a higher level of sacrifice.
Oh,
So, and maybe we can compare it to someone who is not a very, very close friend or someone who's an intimate, that giving that person something that is not perfect doesn't have quite the same uh, quality as giving it something that is blemished, that to one who you claim to love. That the more you love someone, the more the details matter. You know, they say love is in the details. And I think it's in two senses, you know, that when you love something, you really, really want it to be, you pay far more attention to it than you would otherwise. So yes, but there's a whole statement about the fact that certain blemishes are not acceptable within Judaism, and certain blemishes are, because if they can be removed from the animal easily, they are not considered serious blemishes. So when it comes to discussing blemishes, they discuss what blemishes would rule the animal out and what blemishes nevertheless could be okay. And on the other hand, there are blemishes outside of the framework of Jewish practice that would be acceptable in a non-Jewish setting or non-Israelite setting. And welcome, Mike Smith. It's good to see you.
what about blemishes to people?
That's okay. Great question. And it's in Leviticus, and it talks about blemishes of animals that are not acceptable, and it also talks about blemishes of humans. So certain types of it defines exactly what those blemishes are, and says what's interesting. It says that such a person, if they are a priest, a male priest, they cannot minister at the altar, but they are entitled to all the benefits and perks that priests are entitled to. So while they may not be on public display, because very often human nature is that when you see someone who looks unusual or is unusual in some way, it draws attention to something that, in the case of making an offering and bringing a sacrifice, that is not where you want people's attention to be drawn. So you don't want to put people on display in that sense. And, it's a circus act. But on the other hand, this is something that they couldn't help. They were born that way. And for that reason, they're as entitled to a regular priest, if they're priests, to all the perks. Yeah, I mean, there's a way of not denying these sorts of things and trying to find a way that is compassionate to handle it. And there's a far greater context to things than I think we always admit. We sort of see things within our own cultural context, and it's very hard for us to avoid judging beyond that cultural context. And we don't
Yeah.
realize that we're limited in that regard. It's a serious problem, actually. There are others who have made that observation and seen mistakes made when one nation tries to impose its cultural context on another nation. It is not fair. It's insulting. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point.